The afternoon sun hung low over the rooftops as Elena Pierce guided her car along Oakwood Drive, savoring the gentle, rustling sounds of autumn leaves. She enjoyed small routines like these, the short drive to the grocery store, a quiet cup of tea once she returned, and perhaps a call with her daughter, Maya, to hear about her work at the community center. The stillness felt like a gift after decades of raising children and working as a nurse, now replaced by the calm of retirement. As she turned onto Elm Street, a quiet road leading toward the center of town, a glimpse in her rearview mirror caught her attention. A police car was following her, keeping a steady but deliberate distance. She brushed it off initially. Maybe they were patrolling, or maybe there had been a recent crime nearby. She reminded herself that, after all, she'd done nothing wrong. Still, the sight unsettled her. The town was small and friendly, and Elena was not used to feeling watched. She continued on, focusing on the peaceful rhythm of her drive. But with every turn she made, the police car mirrored her movements. When she finally reached the wide, leafy stretch of Cedar Lane, a seldom used route she'd taken on a whim, she glanced back and realized the cruiser was still there, its presence looming in her mirror like a shadow she couldn't shake. Her fingers tightened around the steering wheel. Arriving at a red light, she glanced again, this time studying the officers inside. The driver wore dark sunglasses, his gaze fixed ahead, but there was something tense about his posture. Beside him, his partner, a young woman with short blonde hair, was also staring straight ahead, her fingers fidgeting on her lap. A few more blocks, and Elena felt a cold wave of dread settle over her as the cruiser's lights finally flickered on. She was being pulled over. Taking a deep breath, Elena guided her car toward the side of the road, rolling down her window as she came to a stop. She kept her hands visible on the steering wheel, remembering all the advice she'd given her children. Respect authority. Stay calm. Make no sudden movements. She'd never dreamed she'd have to follow her own advice like this. A moment later, the driver's door of the police cruiser opened, and Officer Brad Tully approached her car. He was tall and solidly built, his frame shadowing her window as he loomed closer. His expression was masked by dark sunglasses, but his mouth was set in a hard line. Behind him, his partner, Officer Grace Larson, remained in the cruiser, watching intently. "License and registration," Officer Tully demanded, his voice low and brusque. Elena swallowed, reaching slowly into her glove compartment for her documents, then handing them to him. "Good afternoon, officer," she said softly, her voice calm but steady. "Could you tell me what's going on?" Tully ignored her question, flipping through her registration and license with an indifferent air. His silence felt heavy, a disapproval that lingered in the air, thick and unyielding. The minutes stretched, each one pressing down on her shoulders. Finally, Tully looked up from her papers. "Step out of the vehicle." Elena's heart jolted. "Officer, is there a problem? I haven't done anything wrong." Tully's mouth tightened, a trace of impatience flickering across his face. "Ma'am, exit the vehicle. Now." Her pulse quickened. Elena wanted to argue, to tell him that she was just a grandmother on a trip to buy groceries, but something about the cold set of his jaw warned her that any protest would only make things worse. She unbuckled her seatbelt, her hands trembling slightly, and slowly stepped out of the car. As she stood by the side of the road, the cool autumn breeze brushing against her skin, she felt the weight of their scrutiny. Tully's gaze raked over her, assessing, searching for something only he seemed to see. Behind him, Larson had exited the cruiser, watching with an expression that was harder to read. Her eyes held a glint of something. Hesitation, perhaps? But her stance was firm, loyal to her partner's lead. Tully began his inspection, peering through her car window and rifling through her glove compartment and center console. Elena felt her frustration rising as her insurance papers scattered across the passenger seat. "Excuse me, Officer Tully," she managed, her voice carefully measured. "Is there a reason for this search? I've complied with every instruction." Tully didn't even look up. "Do you have any idea how many people use this street to evade checkpoints?" he said, his tone flat, almost dismissive. "Late afternoon, quiet roads, it's exactly the kind of route someone trying to avoid attention would take." Elena was stunned. Avoiding attention? "Sir, I'm going to the grocery store. There's no reason to suspect me of anything." But Tully ignored her, shifting his attention to Larson. "Grace, keep an eye on her." Larson nodded, though her eyes flickered between Elena and her partner with what seemed like a trace of unease. Elena took a slow breath, feeling anger begin to stir beneath her skin. She was a law-abiding citizen, a grandmother, someone who had worked her entire life to make a difference in her community. The indignity of being treated this way, as though she were a criminal, gnawed at her. Her composure slipped for a moment, and she spoke with a voice tinged with frustration. "You're making a mistake. I've lived in this town my whole life. I don't deserve to be treated like this." Tully's eyes flashed, and he took a step closer. "Ma'am," he said, his voice sharpening, "keep quiet, or you'll make this worse for yourself." The threat lingered in the air, a chilling reminder of his authority and her helplessness. Elena pressed her lips together, forcing herself to remain silent, though a part of her wanted to shout, to scream, to demand answers. For several minutes, she stood there in silence, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as she watched him dismantle her car piece by piece, her belongings tossed aside like meaningless scraps. Each item he discarded, her grocery list, her phone, her carefully folded tissues, felt like an invasion, a tiny theft of the dignity she had fought so hard to keep intact. When he finally stepped back, his expression was dark and unfathomable. "You're clear," he muttered, though he didn't apologize, didn't offer any explanation. Instead, he looked at her with a hard, lingering gaze, as if he were daring her to argue. Elena felt the urge to fight back, to demand answers, but her instincts told her it would be futile. She gathered her scattered belongings, her hands trembling as she placed each item back in its rightful place, feeling the stares of both officers boring into her. As she closed her door and turned to leave, she stole a glance back, only to find Tully still watching her, a dangerous glint in his eyes. As she drove away, heart pounding, Elena knew this encounter was far from over. The unsettling encounter lingered in Elena's mind as she drove slowly through town, her grip tight on the steering wheel. She'd thought the ordeal was over, that whatever animosity Officer Tully harbored had been left behind on the side of Cedar Lane. But a glance in her rearview mirror showed otherwise. There he was, following her again. Her heart began to pound, each beat echoing in her chest as if her body were warning her of danger. She kept to the speed limit, turned on her blinker carefully, and obeyed every traffic law to the letter. But no matter how measured her actions, the black and white cruiser stayed right on her tail. Her mind raced. What could he possibly want now? He'd already inspected her car, gone through her things, and treated her with such blatant disrespect. What could this man possibly have against her? Trying to keep calm, she took a different route, hoping he'd stop following her. She turned onto Sycamore Drive, a narrow, tree-lined street that wound through a quiet residential area. Perhaps if she drove slowly enough, he'd lose interest. But he didn't. The cruiser stayed close, its presence pressing in on her like a shadow she couldn't escape. She could feel his gaze from the rearview mirror, piercing and watchful, as if he were looking for any excuse to stop her again. By the time Elena reached the intersection at Birch Avenue, her nerves were frayed, and her patience had worn thin. She pulled over and let out a deep breath, hoping that maybe, if she stopped of her own accord, he would pass her by. Instead, Tully's cruiser pulled up right behind her, his flashing lights flickering on once again. She closed her eyes, feeling a surge of anger mixed with fear. How much further was this man willing to go? She'd lived in this town for decades, served in local hospitals, raised her children here, and now this stranger was treating her as though she were a criminal in her own community. Before she could fully gather her thoughts, Tully was at her window again, his partner, Officer Larson, a few steps behind him. The expression on Larson's face was hard to read. There was a hint of uncertainty, even discomfort, but she stayed silent, arms crossed over her chest, her posture guarded. "Is there something I can help you with, officer?" Elena asked, her voice carrying a newfound strength. She was tired of being afraid, tired of feeling powerless. "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am," Tully said curtly, completely ignoring her question. Elena took a steadying breath, meeting his gaze with defiance. You already stopped me once. I've done nothing wrong. Are you going to tell me why you're doing this? A flash of irritation crossed Tully's face, and for a brief moment, she saw something raw and angry lurking beneath his stoic exterior. I'm not here to answer your questions, ma'am. Step out of the vehicle, or I'll make you. The sharpness in his tone was unmistakable. Behind him, Larson shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Elena with a flicker of concern. But she remained silent, unwilling to contradict her partner. Feeling trapped, Elena opened her door and stepped out, facing Tully with a look of quiet determination. She wouldn't let him see her fear. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Turn around and put your hands on the car, he ordered. For what? Elena demanded, incredulous. You have no right. Put your hands on the car, he repeated, louder this time, his voice cutting through the quiet street. Realizing she had no choice, Elena complied, turning and placing her hands against the cold metal of her own car, her breath catching as he began to pat her down. It was humiliating, standing there in her own neighborhood, feeling the weight of his scrutiny on her. As he patted her down, a small crowd began to form. People walking their dogs, neighbors glancing out from their front yards, a mother with her toddler on a bicycle. They all stopped, watching with a mixture of curiosity and concern. The quiet murmurs and exchanged glances cut at her pride, but she held herself steady. Finally, Tully stepped back, satisfied, or perhaps disappointed that he hadn't found anything. There's nothing here, officer, she said, her voice barely a whisper, her shoulders straightening as she turned to face him again. This is harassment. Harassment? Tully scoffed, crossing his arms. You're the one making this difficult. Her frustration boiled over. I'm not the one making this difficult. I'm a retired nurse, a grandmother. I'm just going to the store. Tully's eyes darkened, his lips pulling into a smirk that was both cold and mocking. A grandmother, huh? Seems pretty suspicious to me. His voice dripped with sarcasm, a tone meant to humiliate. Larson, who had been watching quietly, finally took a step forward, her expression tense. Brad, she said quietly, I think we've done enough here. Tully shot her a warning look, his jaw clenching. Grace, if you're not going to help, maybe you should go back to the car. For a moment, Larson hesitated, looking between Tully and Elena with a flicker of indecision. Then, with a resigned sigh, she stepped back, her face pale. Elena took the opportunity to stand her ground. I know my rights, Officer Tully, and I know that what you're doing isn't right. Is that so? He sneered. You think you're so innocent. But people like you. He trailed off, his gaze narrowing, as if a storm were brewing behind his eyes. I could make this a whole lot worse for you. You wouldn't want that, would you? The threat hung in the air, a warning that chilled her to the bone. She glanced at the gathering crowd, hoping someone might step forward to intervene, but no one moved. They were all frozen, eyes wide as they watched the scene unfold. Tully leaned in, his voice dropping to a low, menacing whisper. You think you can talk to me that way? Make demands? I don't think so. People like you think you're above the law. Elena's breath caught, her heart pounding. She knew that arguing would only escalate the situation, but the injustice of it all, the way he was treating her, the way he was trying to break her spirit, was too much to bear. Before she could speak again, Tully took a step back, his smirk widening as he noticed the growing crowd. He addressed her loudly, ensuring his voice carried. You can put on a show if you want, ma'am. It doesn't change the fact that you're wasting police time. Behind him, Larson's face was ashen, her hands clenched at her sides. The officer's apparent enjoyment of her discomfort seemed to trouble her, but she still didn't intervene. In a final attempt to reason with him, Elena's voice softened. Officer, please. I've done nothing wrong. This isn't just about me anymore, this is wrong. Tully scoffed, shaking his head. Save it. I've had enough of this. He took a deliberate step back, his gaze flickering over her car. I think I'll leave you with a little reminder to respect authority. The words sent a shiver down her spine. Before she could fully process what he meant, Tully turned and strode back to his cruiser. A moment later, he emerged with a small red gasoline canister in hand. Elena's heart dropped. "No," she whispered, instinctively stepping forward. "You can't do this." But Tully merely glanced over his shoulder, a malicious glint in his eye. He emptied the gasoline onto the hood of her car, his movements quick and efficient, as if he'd done this 100 times before. Elena watched in horror, her mind reeling as he pulled a lighter from his pocket. "Officer Larson," she cried, her voice pleading. "Stop him. This is wrong." Larson stood motionless, her face stricken, but her loyalty to her partner kept her frozen in place. Tully flicked the lighter, and the small flame flickered in the autumn breeze before he tossed it onto her car. Flames erupted almost instantly, consuming the gasoline with a roar as they climbed the hood, licking their way up toward the windshield. Elena staggered back, the heat searing her face, her horror mirrored in the wide eyes of the gathering crowd. Her car, her reliable, old car, was engulfed in flames, each crackling ember a testament to the cruelty of the man before her. The smoke rose thick and black into the sky, a dark signal that something had gone terribly wrong. Elena staggered back, watching her car ignite before her eyes. The heat of the flames was oppressive, forcing her to take another step away, her gaze fixed on the orange and red blaze that licked hungrily at the hood of her vehicle. She clutched her hands to her mouth, feeling helpless, exposed, and humiliated. Her car, a loyal companion over years of grocery runs, family visits, and quiet drives along familiar streets, was being consumed in front of her. Her mind struggled to accept what her eyes were seeing, the devastation hitting her in waves, each one more intense than the last. The small crowd that had gathered stood silent, their expressions a mixture of shock, horror, and disbelief. They murmured to one another, but no one dared to step forward, transfixed by the surreal sight. Smartphones appeared, recording the incident, and Elena's heart twisted at the thought that her private nightmare was being broadcast for anyone to see. In that instant, Elena felt the weight of humiliation settle heavily on her. She had always held her head high, known and respected by her community. Now, here she was, surrounded by strangers witnessing her dignity being stripped away by a man who wore the uniform that was meant to protect her. Officer Brad Tully stood a few steps back, his face expressionless, almost detached. His partner, Officer Grace Larson, looked away, avoiding Elena's pleading gaze. Desperate, Elena looked directly at Larson. "Please, Officer Larson," she said, her voice breaking, "you know this isn't right. You don't have to stand by and watch." Larson's lips parted as if she might finally speak, but her eyes flicked nervously to Tully, and she quickly pressed them shut, looking down at her feet. Elena's hope faded, replaced by a raw, unfiltered anger she hadn't felt in years. She turned her focus back to Tully, her voice trembling with fury. "This is destruction of property," she said, her voice rising with each word. "You're abusing your power. How can you do this and still call yourself a law officer?" Tully only smirked, dismissing her with a casual shrug. "Maybe next time you'll think twice before wasting our time, ma'am." The cruelty in his voice cut deeply, each word laced with a contempt Elena couldn't understand. What could she have done to warrant such hatred? She was a grandmother, a retired nurse, a woman who had only ever worked to help people in this very community. But here she was, under the heel of a man who saw her only as an inconvenience, someone to be punished rather than protected. Just then, the crowd's murmurs grew louder. Elena noticed the cell phones pointed at Tully, and for the first time, she saw uncertainty flicker across his face. He was beginning to realize that his actions weren't going unnoticed, that every step of his abuse of power was being captured, recorded, and shared. "What if someone's filming?" Larson whispered urgently, her voice shaking. Tully's jaw tightened, his gaze darting over the onlookers. He forced a laugh, though it sounded hollow. "It's fine," he muttered, though the confidence had drained from his voice. "She doesn't have any proof against us. It's her word against ours." "Fine," Larson hissed, panic lacing her voice as she cast a glance at the burning car. "The captain will have our badges for this. You just burned a civilian's car for no reason." Tully's face paled. He clenched his fists, his knuckles turning white, as he scanned the crowd with wide eyes. The weight of what he had done, the irreversibility of it, seemed to crash down on him all at once. Then, through the haze of smoke and murmurs of the crowd, a figure appeared, making his way through the bystanders with steady, deliberate steps. He was tall, his frame casting a long shadow against the late afternoon light. There was a calm authority in his stride, an unwavering composure that silenced the crowd as he moved forward. The moment Elena saw him, relief flooded her chest, her heart pounding with a sudden hope. It was David, her husband. David Pierce, the former police captain, had spent 30 years serving the very community that now looked on in horror. He had once trained officers like Tully, drilling into them the principles of honor, responsibility, and restraint. His record was impeccable, his name synonymous with integrity. But in this moment, David wasn't an officer. He was a husband, witnessing the devastation that had been inflicted upon his wife. Tully froze, his eyes widening as recognition dawned. The crowd seemed to part instinctively, their whispers growing quieter as they realized who had arrived. Larson looked between David and Tully, confusion giving way to understanding. She had heard of David, knew his reputation, his authority, and her face went pale. David stopped a few feet from the officers, his gaze hard and unyielding as he took in the scene. The flames licking at the twisted metal of Elena's car, the twisted smirk that had yet to leave Tully's face, and his wife, trembling, her face streaked with tears. The anguish in her eyes struck him like a blow, filling him with a controlled fury that simmered beneath the surface. Without raising his voice, David looked at Tully and asked, "Do you have any idea who I am?" Tully swallowed, the confidence draining from him. "Sir, David cut him off, his voice sharp. "Answer the question, officer. Do you know who I am?" Tully shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Larson as if searching for support, but she was backing away, her gaze lowered, her face stricken with guilt. She no longer seemed willing to defend her partner, the gravity of their actions weighing heavily on her. David took a step closer, his gaze unrelenting. "I spent my entire career teaching officers how to treat civilians with respect. I told them to act with integrity, to protect the people who trust them with their safety. And here you are, burning my wife's car because, what? Because you're angry?" Tully stammered, the usual confidence and smugness replaced with a pale, shaken expression. She was acting suspicious. "We were doing our job, sir." "Your job?" David's voice was deadly calm, his words precise. "You think it's your job to terrorize an innocent woman, to humiliate her, to destroy her property?" Tully was silent, his mouth opening and closing as he searched for words that would not come. He glanced again at Larson, whose face showed nothing but shame. David's gaze turned colder, his disappointment clear. "I knew rookies like you, Tully. Eager, confident, convinced that they were above the rules. I always told them the same thing. One day, you'll meet someone who'll hold you accountable." Tully's face flushed. For a moment, he looked as though he might argue back, but then he saw the crowd around them, the phones pointed at him, and his shoulders sagged. The realization of the consequences he'd unleashed seemed to dawn on him fully now. Larson, at last, found her voice. "Sir, she trailed off, looking down at her feet, her hands wringing nervously. David turned his attention to her. "And you, Larson? Do you think this is justice?" "No, sir," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm sorry." David took a steadying breath, his composure never wavering, and looked at both officers, his expression hardened. "There's no apology in the world that can make up for what you did today. Not to me, and certainly not to her. But you can start by doing the right thing." The silence that followed was oppressive, the weight of his words pressing down on the officers and the gathered crowd alike. Tully's face crumpled, and he lowered his head, unable to meet David's gaze. He looked away, ashamed, the smug arrogance gone. Elena reached for David's hand, her fingers entwining with his as she leaned into his strength. The anger she had felt softened slightly, replaced by a flicker of hope, a sense of justice slowly taking form. David glanced down at her, his face softening, and then turned back to the officers. I suggest you put in a report, Tully. The whole town saw what you did. And from here on out, every single one of these people will be watching. I suggest you think long and hard about the kind of officer you want to be. Tully nodded, his face a mask of shame, and walked slowly back to the cruiser, Larson following behind him. The crowd parted as the officers passed, watching in silence as they got into their car and drove away. As the last of the smoke from Elena's car began to dissipate, David and Elena stood side by side, the weight of the moment settling over them. The humiliation and fear still lingered, but so did a small, comforting sense of vindication. In that moment, she knew she wasn't alone. Together, they would face what came next, side by side, standing strong. In the silence, David squeezed her hand, his quiet voice cutting through the stillness. They'll have to answer for this, he promised, his voice filled with resolve. Every single one of them. The following morning, the echoes of the previous day's humiliation still haunted Elena. As she sat at the kitchen table, absently stirring her tea, images of her car engulfed in flames flickered through her mind. She still felt the heat on her skin, the helplessness that had tightened around her throat like a vice, and the humiliation of watching her dignity burn with that car. David, sitting across from her, watched her with steady, concerned eyes, his hands folded on the table as he waited for her to speak. Before either of them could say a word, the front door opened, and in strode their daughter, Maya, her face tense with concern. News traveled quickly in their town, especially after the video of the incident had made rounds on social media. Maya, a community organizer known for her sharp wit and relentless advocacy, had heard about what happened to her mother almost as soon as it was posted. "Mom, Dad," she greeted, her voice thick with barely restrained anger. She wrapped her arms around her mother, hugging her tightly before turning her attention to David. "Why didn't you call me? I had to find out through someone else." "We didn't want to worry you, honey," Elena said, placing a comforting hand on her daughter's arm. But Maya's eyes flashed with anger, her jaw clenched as she tried to steady her breathing. "This is more than worrying," Maya replied, her voice trembling. "This is an attack on you, on our family, and by officers who are supposed to protect us. This isn't just wrong, it's an abuse of power. I knew the department had issues, but I never thought it would hit this close to home." She shook her head, pacing the length of the kitchen. David held up a hand, urging calm. "Maya, I understand your anger. Trust me, I feel it too. But we need to think carefully about our next steps. This can't be handled rashly." "Carefully?" Maya nearly laughed, the bitterness seeping through her words. "Dad, we're past careful. People need to know what happened. We can't just brush this under the rug." She looked at Elena, her expression softening. "Mom, you shouldn't have to go through this alone, and neither should anyone else in this town." Elena met her daughter's fierce gaze, a surge of pride mixing with her lingering fear. Maya had always been strong, passionate, and unafraid to stand up against injustice. But the thought of dragging her daughter into the tangled mess of this ordeal unsettled her. "Maya," she began gently, "I know you want to help, and I'm grateful, but this is a lot to take on. And the people involved, they're not going to let this go without a fight." David interjected, his tone calm but firm. "Your mother's right, Maya. Tully and his partner, Larson, are already in trouble. The department knows, and I know they're going to feel the pressure. But rushing into this could backfire." Maya's face softened as she looked at her mother, seeing the toll the experience had taken on her. Her mother's hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly as she held her mug. Her father's face, usually stoic, bore new lines of tension. It was then that Maya realized just how deeply this incident had affected them both. "Okay," she said, her voice softening. "I'll hold back for now. But there are people who want answers, and I'm going to make sure they get them. I can't let this slide, Mom. This isn't just about our family. This is about the whole community." David gave a small nod. "Agreed. But let's do it with a clear head. This isn't the first time we've had to deal with injustice, and it won't be the last. Let's think carefully about how we're going to make an impact that will last." Maya settled into a chair beside her parents, her mind already working. She knew this was an opportunity, albeit one born of pain and frustration, to highlight a greater issue. People in their town trusted the Pierce family. They'd been active members of the community for decades, and if they could stand up to the abuse of power, perhaps others would feel empowered to do the same. "Mom," Maya began gently, her eyes serious, "would you be willing to tell your story? Not just to me, but to the community. People trust you, and your story might be exactly what they need to hear. You don't have to do anything you don't want to, but I think it could make a difference." Elena looked down at her hands, considering her daughter's words. She wasn't one for public displays or speeches, and the idea of sharing the most vulnerable moment of her life made her stomach turn. But as she looked up at Maya's hopeful, determined face, she saw something she hadn't seen in herself since the incident, a glimmer of strength, a spark of resilience. David placed a reassuring hand on hers. "Whatever you decide, we're with you. This is your choice." Elena took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I'll do it," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "If it means helping others, if it means making sure no one else has to go through this, then I'll tell my story." A sense of purpose filled the room, a quiet resolve binding the family together. Maya nodded, her expression softening with pride and respect for her mother's courage. She leaned over and squeezed Elena's hand. "Thank you, Mom. We'll do this together." As they sat in the kitchen, making plans to share Elena's story, a sense of calm washed over her. It wasn't the kind of peace she'd known before. It was deeper, tinged with sadness, but also with purpose. She was stepping into unknown territory, but she knew she wasn't alone. Later that day, Maya put out a call to the community center, arranging a gathering to discuss issues of police accountability and community safety. News of the event spread quickly, and by evening, the center was packed. Neighbors, friends, and community leaders arrived, their expressions a mixture of curiosity, concern, and solidarity. When the time came for her to speak, Elena felt her throat tighten. She stood at the front of the room, her eyes scanning the familiar faces, the many people who had been part of her life for years. These were people who had seen her raise her family, who had been her patients at the hospital, who had shared in the joys and struggles of small-town life. She took a deep breath and began. She spoke of the events that had led her to that quiet road, of the sense of dread that had settled over her when she realized she was being followed, and of the terror she felt as Officer Tully poured gasoline over her car and set it ablaze. Her voice trembled at times, but her resolve never wavered. By the time she finished, the room was silent. Some of the listeners had tears in their eyes. Others sat in stunned silence, their expressions hardening as they absorbed the cruelty she had endured. Then, as if moved by a collective spirit, they began to clap. It started softly, then grew louder, echoing through the room. Maya stepped up beside her mother, her arm wrapped around her shoulders. "This is why we're here tonight," she said, addressing the room. "To stand up for what's right. To make sure no one in our community feels alone or unsafe. This isn't just about my mother. This is about every single one of us." The gathering continued into the night, the attendees sharing their own stories, their own experiences with injustice, and the struggles they faced in their community. Many people who had kept silent out of fear felt emboldened by Elena's courage, their voices joining hers in a growing wave of determination. That night, as they returned home, Elena felt a new sense of resolve settle over her. She had been humiliated, but she hadn't been defeated. She had felt alone, but now she knew her family and her community stood beside her. Maya walked with her arm around her mother's shoulder. "We'll keep pushing, Mom," she said softly. "We'll do this together, every step of the way." David followed close behind, his steady presence a silent promise that he would protect them, that he would see this fight through to the end. Together, they stepped forward into the night, bound by purpose, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. As the days passed, the momentum around Elena's story grew stronger. The video of the incident circulated online, gathering support from those who were outraged by the injustice she had suffered. Community leaders, activists, and residents from all over the town called for a response from the police department. Tully and Larson had not yet faced any formal consequences, and the silence from the department only fueled the public's anger. It wasn't long before Maya's organizing efforts gained traction. She organized a peaceful rally outside the police station, inviting anyone who felt compelled to stand against the abuse of power. People showed up in droves, holding signs, chanting for accountability, and voicing support for Elena and all those who had been mistreated by authority figures who had abused their positions. Elena watched the gathering from the edges of the crowd, a mixture of pride and fear simmering within her. David stood beside her, a steadying presence, his hand clasped firmly around hers. He had always been protective of her, and she knew it was difficult for him to watch her endure the turmoil that had become their reality. But today, he was here to support her, ready to confront his own past in law enforcement if it meant standing up for the woman he loved. After about an hour, a figure appeared on the steps of the station, his uniform crisp, his face taut with tension. Captain Raymond Steele, a longtime colleague of David's and the head of the local precinct, scanned the crowd, his eyes narrowing when they landed on David and Elena. David knew Steele well. They had served together for nearly 2 decades before David retired. Steele had always been a man of few words, but he respected David and knew his character was beyond reproach. Yet now, as he looked at David, there was a flicker of discomfort in his gaze. David let go of Elena's hand, straightening his shoulders as he stepped forward to meet Steele. The crowd quieted, watching with bated breath as the two men who had once shared a camaraderie now faced each other on opposite sides of a deep, painful divide. "David," Steele greeted him, his voice barely concealing the strain. "Let's talk inside." But David shook his head. "No, Ray. I'm not going to hide behind closed doors. This conversation needs to be heard." Steele's face tightened, but he gave a short nod, glancing uneasily at the crowd. "Very well," he said, his voice firm. "Then let's address this." David turned to the crowd, his voice carrying with calm authority. "Thank you all for being here. My wife, Elena, and I appreciate your support. We're here today because what happened to her could happen to anyone." He looked pointedly at Steele. "And we're here to demand accountability." Steele held his ground, crossing his arms as he addressed the crowd. "I understand the concerns you all have. Let me assure you, the department takes this matter very seriously. Officers Tully and Larson have been placed on temporary suspension while we conduct an internal investigation." The crowd's response was immediate, a wave of disappointed murmurs, their anger reigniting. Steele's words felt hollow, as though the department's attempt at discipline was merely for appearances. David shook his head. "Suspension isn't enough, Ray. These are officers who abused their power, who harassed and terrorized my wife without any provocation. Tully set her car on fire, and Larson did nothing to stop him. And you're telling us they're on temporary suspension?" Steele's jaw clenched as he tried to hold onto his composure. "David, I understand your frustration, but we need to follow protocol. This is a complex matter, and we're handling it as swiftly and thoroughly as we can." The crowd's anger grew louder, voices demanding justice, asking why a known, respected figure in the community was being treated with such disregard. Maya stepped forward, her eyes blazing. "Captain Steele, people here need to see real consequences, not empty promises. The officers who harassed my mother and burned her car should not be allowed to wear the badge." Steele looked at Maya, his expression softening slightly. "Ms. Pierce, I understand your concerns, but we must also be fair to everyone involved. We can't make hasty decisions that could impact these officers' careers without thorough review." "Fair," Maya replied, her voice hard. "What about fairness for my mother? She was humiliated, terrified, and her property was destroyed without reason. How is a review fair to her? This isn't about careers. This is about justice." Steele's gaze flickered to David, as if silently appealing to him to de-escalate the situation. But David remained firm, his gaze unyielding. Steele hesitated, then sighed heavily. "David," Steele said quietly, lowering his voice as if trying to reach him on a personal level, "think about this. We've both been on that side of the badge. We know the pressures officers face." David shook his head, his voice firm. "This isn't about the pressures, Ray. It's about character. I never taught anyone on this force to act like Tully did. I taught them to protect, to serve, to uphold the values of integrity and fairness. What Tully did was a violation of everything we stand for. And you know it. The silence that followed was thick, charged with the tension of Steele's inner conflict. He glanced around, sensing the discontent rippling through the crowd, the distrust in their eyes. He knew he couldn't ignore this any longer. Finally, Steele lifted his hands, signaling for the crowd's attention. "We will be taking this further," he announced, his voice more resolute. Effective immediately, Officers Tully and Larson will face a public disciplinary hearing. The department will ensure transparency throughout this process. I give you my word. The crowd stirred, a murmur of cautious approval passing through them. It wasn't exactly what they'd hoped for, but it was a start, a step toward accountability. David nodded, his expression unreadable, though a flicker of satisfaction crossed his face. "Thank you, Captain Steele. We'll be watching to make sure you keep that promise." Steele gave a curt nod, meeting David's gaze. The two men shared a long, silent look, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Though they were no longer on the same side, there was a mutual respect that could not be erased by a single, ugly incident. As Steele retreated back into the precinct, the crowd began to disperse, conversations buzzing with renewed hope. Maya turned to her parents, her face a mixture of relief and determination. "It's a start," she said, though her voice held a trace of doubt. Elena, exhausted but emboldened, reached for David's hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "It is, and it's only the beginning." The three of them walked together toward the edge of the gathering, breathing in the cool autumn air. For the first time since that terrible day, Elena felt a sense of lightness, of hope, a tentative belief that perhaps, by standing together, they could indeed make a difference. The morning of the disciplinary hearing arrived with a chilly wind, sweeping through the town as though carrying the tension that had settled over its people. The town hall, a modest but sturdy brick building that had hosted countless community meetings, weddings, and memorials, was filled with residents who had come to witness the hearing. Some had been there at the rally outside the police station, others had only seen the video online, but all had come to see if justice would finally be served. Elena sat near the front, flanked by David on one side and Maya on the other. She felt a knot in her stomach, a mixture of apprehension and determination. She wanted closure, but more than that, she wanted accountability, not just for herself, but for every person who had ever felt the sting of injustice. The hall grew quiet as Captain Steele entered, followed by Officer Tully and Officer Larson. Both officers were in full uniform, but their expressions couldn't have been more different. Larson looked pale, her gaze fixed downward, her usual confidence stripped away. Tully, however, carried himself with a defiant air, his jaw set in a way that suggested he was still unrepentant, still sure of his authority, if not his actions. The presiding officer, a stoic, elderly man named Judge Franklin, tapped his gavel, calling the room to order. He was known for his strict adherence to the law and a reputation for fair judgment. As he surveyed the room, his gaze lingered briefly on Elena, then shifted to the two officers before him. "Officer Tully, Officer Larson, today we gather to review the events of last week," he began, his voice calm but firm. "You are accused of harassment, abuse of power, and destruction of property, all in violation of the principles of your duty. Each of you will have the opportunity to explain your actions." Tully's face remained impassive, but Larson's shoulders slumped further, the tension clear in her posture. Elena observed them carefully, feeling a pang of empathy for Larson, who looked as though she were carrying a tremendous weight. But that empathy was tempered by her memory of Larson's silence, her refusal to intervene as Tully had destroyed Elena's car. Judge Franklin turned to Larson first. "Officer Larson, as the partner of Officer Tully, you are responsible for upholding the same standards of conduct. How do you account for your role in these events?" Larson swallowed, her voice barely audible as she answered. "Your Honor, she hesitated, glancing briefly at Tully, whose gaze bore into her with an intensity that made her flinch. She looked away, visibly struggling to gather her thoughts. "I let my partner take the lead, and I followed. I thought it was protocol, but looking back, I see I should have spoken up. I should have stopped him." "Do you believe Officer Tully's actions were justified?" Judge Franklin asked, his tone neither accusing nor forgiving. No, Larson admitted, her voice trembling slightly. I knew it was wrong. I didn't have the courage to stop him. I should have, and I'm sorry. Her admission hung in the air, filling the hall with a heavy silence. Larson's face was a mask of regret. Her shoulders slumped as though the weight of her guilt had finally become too much to bear. Judge Franklin nodded thoughtfully. Thank you for your honesty, Officer Larson. That will be taken into consideration. Then he turned his gaze to Tully. Officer Tully, do you have anything to say for yourself? Tully lifted his chin, his voice steady but cold. Your Honor, I did what I thought was necessary. I believed Ms. Pierce was acting suspiciously, and I made a decision to act on that suspicion. If she felt intimidated, well, that's unfortunate, but I was following my duty to ensure public safety. A murmur of disapproval rippled through the room, but Tully's expression remained unchanged. Elena clenched her hands together, her heart sinking as she listened to his defiant words. Even now, he refused to acknowledge any wrongdoing. Public safety? Judge Franklin echoed, his brows drawing together in disbelief. Officer Tully, setting fire to a civilian's car is not public safety. It's an act of intimidation, plain and simple. You used your authority to instill fear, not safety. Do you deny that? Tully's jaw clenched, a flicker of resentment in his eyes. With all due respect, sir, officers need the freedom to make decisions in the field. If we're questioned every time we make a tough call, how are we supposed to do our jobs? That freedom doesn't include burning a citizen's property without cause, Officer Tully, Judge Franklin replied sternly. Your badge does not give you the right to instill terror in the people you swore to protect. David leaned over to Maya, whispering, he's as stubborn as ever. Won't admit a thing. Maya nodded, her face tight with anger. It's like he still thinks he's invincible. Judge Franklin cleared his throat, silencing the room again. Officer Tully, you're correct that law enforcement requires decision-making in challenging circumstances. But when those decisions cross a line, as yours clearly did, you undermine the public's trust. The purpose of this hearing is not just to hold you accountable, but to prevent this behavior from occurring in the future. Tully opened his mouth to speak, but the judge cut him off with a raised hand. You may sit, Officer Tully. The officer sank back in his seat, his face a mask of barely contained resentment. Next to him, Larson's expression softened with a kind of resigned relief, as though she had finally accepted the consequences of her silence. Judge Franklin looked out over the room. I will deliberate over the officer's actions and recommend a course of action. But this much is clear. Trust between law enforcement and the public cannot survive if we allow abuses of power to go unpunished. Officers Tully and Larson will both be suspended without pay, and a final decision regarding their employment will be made after further review. The crowd murmured again, some dissatisfied with the decision, but others nodding in cautious approval. It wasn't the justice many had hoped for, but it was a beginning. For the first time, Elena felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that there might be real consequences, that her voice, and the voices of those who stood by her, were being heard. After the judge adjourned the hearing, people began filing out of the hall, some offering Elena quiet words of encouragement. She accepted each one with gratitude, feeling a sense of unity that buoyed her spirits. As she reached the exit, she saw Larson standing by herself, her head bowed. Despite everything, Elena felt compelled to speak to her. She approached slowly, unsure of what she intended to say. Larson looked up, her eyes red-rimmed. Miss Pierce, she said, her voice thick with remorse. I'm so sorry. I know that doesn't change what happened, but I'm sorry. Elena studied her, seeing a young woman weighed down by her mistakes. For a moment, she saw herself at Larson's age, new to her own career, afraid to speak up against authority. Compassion mingled with her lingering hurt, and she nodded. Thank you for saying that, Elena replied softly. I can see that you're struggling with this, but words alone won't fix the damage done. Larson nodded, looking away. I know, and I'll do what I can to make it right, even if it takes the rest of my career to prove it. A few paces away, David watched, his face thoughtful. He approached as Larson left, taking Elena's hand. You didn't have to speak to her, but I'm glad you did, he said, pride in his voice. Elena looked up at him, a small smile touching her lips. She made a mistake, David. A terrible one. But I think she realizes it now. And maybe that's the first step toward change. Maya joined them, her eyes bright with determination. This is just the beginning, Mom. We're not done yet. There are more stories like yours, more people who need to be heard. Elena nodded, a deep sense of purpose settling over her. She had come here seeking justice, and while she might not have found it entirely, she had found something else, a voice, a resolve, and a community willing to stand beside her. As the three of them walked into the crisp afternoon light, Elena knew this journey was far from over. She had begun it seeking justice for herself, but now, she realized, it was for everyone who had been silenced, everyone who had been wronged. And she would not stop until those voices were heard. The disciplinary hearing had brought some relief, but Elena's sense of justice was far from satisfied. She couldn't shake the image of her burning car, the smirk on Tully's face, and the look of helplessness in Larson's eyes. As she walked through town the following day, she was greeted with sympathetic nods and gentle encouragement from neighbors and strangers alike. It was clear that the town was with her, yet she still felt there was more to be done. That evening, as she sat in her living room with David and Maya, she voiced her thoughts. "We've made some progress," she began, her gaze drifting to the window where the sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the room. "But I can't help feeling that a suspension isn't enough. I want them to truly understand what they've done, to make some kind of real amends." David, sitting beside her, nodded. "I agree, Elena. I know the department is watching, and that there might be further consequences, but I think it's fair to ask for more." Maya leaned forward, her eyes bright with a new idea. "What if we go beyond punishment? What if we ask them to make restitution in a way that helps the community? It won't undo the damage, but it could at least turn some of this pain into something positive." Elena considered this, her heart lifting. "That's exactly what I want. Not just consequences, but change. They should have to give back, to face the people they've wronged and to be part of the solution." Maya nodded with enthusiasm. "I know the perfect place. The community center could use donations and help with the outreach programs. They could volunteer there, see firsthand the people they've impacted." The idea settled over them, resonating as both just and restorative. David, who had been quiet for a moment, gave a slow nod. "I'll talk to Steele. He knows us, and he knows the community well. If we explain our vision, he might see the value in it. Tully and Larson won't just sit out their suspension. They'll have to give something of themselves back to this town." The following morning, David arranged a meeting with Captain Steele. They met at the community center, a place that held a wealth of memories for David. He had attended countless town events there, seen local children grow up in its halls, and watched residents come together through good times and bad. Now, he hoped it would become a symbol of healing. Steele arrived with a hesitant expression, his shoulders slightly hunched, a clear sign of the weight he felt over the situation. He greeted David with a firm handshake and a respectful nod toward Elena. "Elena, David," he said, "I know this isn't enough, and I know it's been hard, but I want you both to know that I'm committed to making this right. If there's anything more I can do, anything within my power, I'll make it happen." David nodded, grateful for Steele's sincerity. "That's what we wanted to discuss, Ray. We think there's more that can be done, something that might actually help the community." Steele's brow furrowed in curiosity. "Go on." Elena took a deep breath, steadying herself. "We'd like to propose a form of restitution, one that would involve Tully and Larson giving back to the community directly." Steele leaned in, listening intently. "We don't want to just see them suspended," Elena continued. "We want them to experience the impact of what they did, to confront it in a meaningful way. We want them to work here, at the community center, helping people they may have overlooked before." Maya, who had been quietly listening, added, "It's about more than just making amends. It's about understanding and empathy. If Tully and Larson work here, they'll be helping with outreach programs, organizing events, and even listening to the stories of those they've affected. They'll see the human side they ignored when they chose to abuse their power." Steele's expression softened, as he considered their proposal. I see what you're aiming for. You want them to take responsibility beyond just facing disciplinary actions. Yes, David replied firmly. Suspending them doesn't teach them anything. It just distances them from what they've done. But if they're here, interacting with the community they wronged, they'll have no choice but to confront the damage they've caused. Steele nodded thoughtfully. I think we can make this happen. I'll bring it to the board, and I'll make sure they understand the value of a hands-on approach to restitution. This town has always taken care of its own, and this might be exactly what Tully and Larson need to learn that. The conversation ended with a handshake and a promise. Steele left with the conviction that this initiative would not only change the lives of Tully and Larson, but also help heal the fractures in the community. 2 weeks later, Tully and Larson returned to the community center, not as officers, but as volunteers. They were dressed in plain clothes, their expressions subdued as they faced the staff, their eyes lowered, avoiding the curious gazes of the other volunteers. Elena and David had come to oversee their first day, watching from a distance as they were introduced to the roles they would undertake. Larson seemed visibly nervous, her face pale as she looked around the center, her gaze darting over the walls filled with photos from community events and the handmade decorations crafted by children. She looked as though she were bracing herself, every sound seeming to amplify her discomfort. Tully, on the other hand, was tense, his jaw set as if he were merely enduring the experience. Their supervisor for the day was Mrs. Anderson, a longtime community volunteer who had helped hundreds of families over the years. She was a petite woman with gray hair, a sharp mind, and a kind but no-nonsense demeanor. She greeted the officers with a curt nod and handed each a clipboard. We're doing a food drive today, and I'll need both of you to assist with sorting donations, organizing boxes, and directing people where they need to go, she instructed. Her tone left no room for complaints. Larson nodded respectfully, looking grateful for the clarity and focus of her task. She immediately began to organize the boxes with an eagerness that bordered on anxiousness. Tully, however, looked around with barely concealed irritation, his expression suggesting he'd rather be anywhere else. As the day wore on, Elena noticed Larson relaxing slightly, even engaging in a quiet conversation with a woman who had come to pick up groceries. Larson listened as the woman shared her story of recent struggles, nodding with empathy and even offering a few words of encouragement. For the first time, Elena saw a glimmer of understanding in her expression, a sign that perhaps this experience was reaching her in some small way. Tully, on the other hand, remained closed off, his interactions with the community stiff and guarded. He moved through the tasks mechanically, avoiding eye contact and keeping his responses brief. At one point, he took a break, stepping outside and leaning against the building, his gaze distant. David, who had observed Tully's behavior from the sidelines, decided to approach him. He walked over, standing beside him in silence for a moment before speaking. You know, Tully, David began, his voice steady but gentle, being here isn't meant to punish you. It's meant to teach you something about the people you're supposed to protect. Tully didn't look at him, his expression unreadable. I don't need to be taught anything, sir. I know how to do my job. David sighed, sensing the resistance but undeterred. The job isn't just about authority, Tully. It's about empathy. It's about knowing the people you serve and understanding their struggles. When you set that aside, you're just wearing a uniform. It doesn't mean anything. Tully's jaw tightened, but David saw a flicker of vulnerability, a crack in the hardened exterior he was holding so tightly to. For the first time, Tully seemed to struggle with a response. Before he could say anything, David continued, think about why you became an officer. Was it for the power? Or was it to make a difference? Because if it was the latter, you're in the right place. If it was the former, then maybe this is where you'll finally realize what this uniform should stand for. With that, David turned and walked back into the center, leaving Tully to process his words. He saw Larson look up as he re-entered, a hesitant but genuine smile of gratitude on her face. She had listened. She had understood. And maybe, in time, Tully would too. As the day drew to a close, Elena and David left the center with a sense of quiet satisfaction. The road to change would be long, but they had taken the first step. And as they walked home together, Elena felt the weight of her experience begin to lift, replaced by the hope that, even in the smallest way, they were beginning to change the world around them. In the weeks that followed, Officers Tully and Larson continued their mandatory service at the community center. The arrangement had stirred mixed emotions among the town's residents. Some saw it as a hopeful step toward accountability, while others viewed it as a mere slap on the wrist. But Elena had faith in the power of this immersive, hands-on restitution. She hoped that being part of the community they'd wronged might plant a seed of understanding and empathy in both officers. Over time, Larson's shift in attitude became noticeable. She began to engage earnestly with the people she encountered, finding genuine satisfaction in helping organize events and offering assistance wherever it was needed. She became particularly invested in the community's youth program, which served as an after-school haven for kids who often had nowhere else to go. Larson started helping the children with their homework, organizing activities, and listening as they shared their dreams and struggles. One afternoon, Elena arrived at the center to drop off a batch of home-cooked meals for the volunteers. As she entered, she was greeted by the sight of Larson sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by a group of children who were listening intently as she read aloud from a storybook. The children's faces were lit with joy, their eyes wide with fascination, and Larson's voice was warm and animated. Larson looked up and noticed Elena watching. A faint blush rose to her cheeks, but she offered Elena a tentative smile before continuing the story. Elena felt a surge of empathy for Larson. She remembered how, in her own youth, she'd been timid and afraid to speak up against authority, a fear she'd had to conquer over years of working in high-stress environments as a nurse. It wasn't easy to learn to stand on your own principles, especially when it meant going against the grain. She could see Larson's own transformation unfolding, and it gave her hope that the young officer's journey to empathy and responsibility was genuine. But Tully was a different story. Tully maintained a stiff distance from the activities at the center, completing his hours with as little interaction as possible. He performed his tasks competently but mechanically, never lingering in any one place long enough to form a connection. He often kept to himself, avoiding eye contact and only engaging when required. On a drizzly Friday afternoon, Elena found herself volunteering for an event at the center. The turnout was impressive, with families gathering for a community meal and children laughing and playing together. In the corner, she noticed Tully standing alone, arms crossed, watching the scene with an inscrutable expression. She felt a familiar pang of frustration. Why was he still so resistant, so closed off? What would it take to break through that wall? After a moment of hesitation, Elena approached him. He glanced at her, his expression guarded but polite. "Afternoon, Officer Tully," she greeted, her voice calm but direct. "Thank you for being here." Tully's gaze shifted, his mouth a tight line. "I'm just doing what I was told, ma'am," he replied stiffly, his tone respectful but distant. Elena held his gaze, undeterred. "I can see that," she said, "but I think there's more to this than simply doing what you're told. If you're willing, there's something here you can learn, about yourself and about the people you serve." Tully's face remained expressionless, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, perhaps defiance, perhaps unease. "With all due respect, Mrs. Pierce, I've been an officer for years. I know how to serve the public." "Do you?" Elena asked, her tone soft but firm. "Serving the public isn't just about enforcing laws. It's about understanding the lives of the people you're protecting. The people who walk these streets every day, who call this town home." Tully's jaw clenched, and for a moment, Elena thought he might turn away. But instead, he took a deep breath, his voice quiet but tense. "You think I don't know hardship?" he murmured, almost to himself. Elena felt a flicker of curiosity. She hadn't expected this response. "I think you may know hardship," she replied carefully. "But sometimes, hardship can harden us, make us forget to see it in others. And that's when we need to be reminded of why we started serving in the first place." Tully's eyes met hers, a guarded vulnerability shining through. "I became an officer to keep people safe," he said, his tone defensive. "That's all I ever wanted." "I believe that," Elena said, her voice gentle. "And I believe that you can still do that, if you're willing to let yourself see the people around you. Not just their actions, but their humanity." The words seemed to strike something deep within him. He nodded, a slow, almost reluctant acknowledgement, and walked away without another word. Elena watched him go, a faint sense of satisfaction mingling with her lingering hope that he would, in time, come to understand the true impact of his choices. In the weeks that followed, Elena noticed a subtle shift in Tully's demeanor. Though still guarded, he seemed to engage a bit more, offering a few quiet words to the other volunteers, and even stopping to listen when the community members shared their stories. It was as if he were beginning to see these people as individuals with lives, struggles, and dreams of their own. One evening, as they were cleaning up after a long day, Tully approached Maya, who was leading an initiative to collect resources for low-income families in town. He cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable, but Maya looked up and greeted him with a friendly smile. "I've seen you working hard for this community," Tully began awkwardly, his hands fidgeting. "And I wanted to apologize for everything. What I did to your mother was wrong. I'm starting to realize that." Maya studied him, her expression thoughtful. "I appreciate that, Officer Tully," she said. "But more than words, what matters is what you choose to do with this understanding. Are you willing to be part of this community, not just in uniform, but as someone who actually cares?" He hesitated, a look of uncertainty crossing his face. I think so. I didn't understand before. I thought being an officer meant keeping control, making quick calls to keep order. I didn't realize the damage that kind of thinking could do." Maya nodded, her expression softening. "It's not too late to change that. What we do here, helping people and connecting with them, it's a way to build real safety and trust, not just control." Tully looked away, a hint of shame in his eyes. "It feels strange," he admitted, "realizing that I might have hurt more people than I helped." "It's okay to feel that way," Maya reassured him. "You're here now, willing to learn and grow. That's more than many people would do." The following weekend, the center held an annual fundraiser. Larson volunteered to manage the event, putting her newfound passion and commitment into every detail. She organized activities for the children, coordinated with local businesses for donations, and even set up a booth for people to share their personal stories. She had become deeply invested, her sincerity and kindness gradually winning over even the most skeptical residents. Tully, to the surprise of many, stepped up to help her, taking on a quieter role behind the scenes. As he worked, he listened closely to the stories of struggle, resilience, and hope that filled the center that day. Each story chipped away at the armor he'd built around himself, and he felt the first pangs of true regret. Late in the evening, when the fundraiser had ended and the guests had gone home, Tully found himself alone with Elena, who had stayed behind to help clean up. "Mrs. Pierce," he said, his voice subdued, "I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know that I understand now. What I did to you, it was unforgivable, and it's going to take me a long time to forgive myself." Elena looked at him, her eyes softening with compassion. "Forgiveness isn't about erasing the past, Officer Tully. It's about making amends and choosing to be better every day. You've taken the first step, and that's what matters." Tully swallowed, nodding slowly. "I hope one day I can earn back the trust one lost. For you, for everyone here." Elena placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, offering him a small, genuine smile. "Then keep showing up, keep helping, and keep listening. You're on the right path. Just don't turn back." As she walked away, Tully stood there, feeling a strange mixture of sorrow and hope. For the first time, he felt the weight of accountability settle on him, not as a burden, but as a promise to do better. In the dim light of the empty center, he felt something within him shift. The rigid certainty that had once defined him was melting away, replaced by a growing sense of responsibility and maybe even purpose. As the months passed, the community center became a space not only for outreach and support, but for reconciliation and healing. Under Maya's leadership, the center began to thrive in ways it never had before. More residents came forward with stories of their own experiences, sharing their struggles and triumphs with a newfound sense of trust. The events were packed with townspeople, and the programs expanded to provide everything from youth mentorship to legal guidance. Elena, Maya, and David could see that something remarkable was unfolding. a community coming together to redefine itself. Larson and Tully, now regular faces at the center, had each found their own path to redemption. Larson had come to see her work there as more than just an obligation. She was at the center nearly every day, helping organize classes for single parents, arranging after-school tutoring sessions, and building connections with the people she'd once distanced herself from behind a badge. The kids, in particular, had become attached to her, viewing her as a caring and dependable presence. Larson had also developed a close friendship with Mrs. Anderson, the longtime volunteer who had initially supervised her and Tully. Mrs. Anderson had a wisdom that Larson found comforting, a calm yet powerful understanding of the value of community. She had grown up in this town, seen its hardships and joys, and treated everyone who came to the center like family. In Mrs. Anderson's steady presence, Larson found a mentor who reinforced her determination to rebuild her life and find a more genuine connection with those around her. Tully, however, still faced a steeper climb. Though he completed each day's tasks with precision, he remained reserved, reluctant to open up. He was attentive to his duties, but it was clear that something in him hadn't yet fully embraced the community. He volunteered with a certain distance, as though still trying to reconcile his own inner turmoil. One afternoon, Elena and David invited Larson and Tully to their home for dinner. It was a significant gesture, one that carried more weight than a simple meal. Maya had encouraged her parents to extend the invitation, hoping it would help Tully feel a genuine sense of connection beyond the structured environment of the center. When they arrived, Elena welcomed them warmly, guiding them into a dining room glowing with the light of candles and the comforting scent of her cooking. The atmosphere was intimate, a world away from the formality of the center. Larson seemed at ease, grateful for the invitation, while Tully's demeanor was more hesitant, as though uncertain of his place in such a setting. As they sat down to eat, conversation flowed easily at first, focusing on lighthearted topics, stories from the community center, memories of the town's past, and shared laughter over small anecdotes. Even Tully managed a few smiles, though his usual reserve still lingered. But as the meal progressed, the conversation grew deeper. Maya, ever the one to press for open discussion, turned to Tully with a gentle but probing question. "Officer Tully," she began, "you've been helping us for a while now. I know it hasn't been easy for you, but I'm curious, has this experience changed anything for you?" Tully looked down, his face shadowed with something complex and painful. He took a deep breath, struggling to find his words. "I guess it has," he said finally, his voice quieter than usual. "For a long time, I thought I was doing my job right. I thought that keeping people in line was the same as keeping people safe. But now," he hesitated, his gaze distant, "now I'm not so sure." David, sensing the depth of Tully's inner conflict, spoke up gently. "It's not easy to face those questions, especially when you've been trained to think one way for so long. But real strength comes from being willing to question yourself, to confront the things that don't sit right." Tully's gaze met David's, a glint of respect in his eyes. "I never expected to feel regret like this. I always thought I was on the right side, that what I did was necessary. But seeing how people look at me now, knowing what I put your family through, I can't help but wonder if I've been wrong." The room fell silent, each person allowing Tully's words to settle. Even Larson looked at him with a new understanding, her own journey mirrored in his quiet admission. Elena reached across the table, her hand resting gently on Tully's. "Acknowledging that takes courage, Officer Tully. And that's the first step toward truly making amends." Her words seemed to reach him, and he nodded, his shoulders relaxing for the first time. "Thank you," he murmured. "I don't deserve it, but thank you." As the evening continued, Larson shared more of her own struggles, opening up about the guilt she'd carried since the incident. She confessed that she had been afraid of standing up to Tully that day, afraid of going against her partner even when she knew he was wrong. "But being at the center," she said softly, "it's shown me that fear isn't an excuse. I let myself be guided by someone else's anger instead of my own conscience, and I have to live with that." Elena squeezed her hand reassuringly. "You've faced that fear now, Grace, and you've chosen a different path. That's what matters." Tully, who had been listening intently, glanced at Larson, his expression one of respect. "You've done well, Grace. Better than I have. Maybe we both have our own paths to follow, she replied, offering him a small, hopeful smile. The evening closed with a warm sense of solidarity, each person bound by the shared understanding that healing was a journey, not a destination. As Larson and Tully prepared to leave, David walked them to the door, resting a hand on Tully's shoulder as they exchanged a quiet, respectful nod. The next week, something remarkable happened. Tully arrived at the center early and approached Maya, who was overseeing a program for at-risk youth. He had an idea, a mentorship initiative, one where he could share his experiences with young people, especially those who might be considering careers in law enforcement. Maya listened, surprised but pleased. "You're saying you want to start a mentorship program?" she asked, her tone encouraging. Tully nodded, a faint but determined resolve in his eyes. "I want to make sure that the next generation doesn't make the same mistakes I did. Maybe if they understand the importance of empathy, they'll do better." The program launched a few weeks later, with Tully as the lead mentor and Larson as his co-leader. Together, they taught the youth about not only the responsibilities of law enforcement, but also the vital importance of community connection, understanding, and compassion. They hosted workshops, took the kids on field trips, and shared stories, honest stories, about the mistakes they had made and the lessons they had learned. Tully was different now. He was no longer the rigid, closed-off officer he had been when he first came to the center. There was a warmth to his manner, a genuine concern in his interactions with the young people he mentored. He listened to their struggles, encouraged their dreams, and taught them that authority came with humility, not superiority. Elena, watching him work, felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. This was the man she had hoped Tully could become, a protector of the people, not just a figure of authority. She saw that his journey had led him to a place of understanding and remorse, and for the first time, she believed that he had truly changed. One afternoon, after a successful mentorship session, Tully approached Elena, his face etched with gratitude. "Mrs. Pierce," he began, his voice earnest, "I just want to thank you. If you hadn't given me a second chance, if you hadn't challenged me to look deeper, I don't think I'd be standing here today. I've learned more in the past few months than I did in years on the force." Elena smiled warmly, her eyes misting with emotion. "You've earned that change, Officer Tully. I'm proud of the man you're becoming, and I think the whole community can see it too." He nodded, a quiet pride in his expression. "I'll never forget what you taught me. I'm going to keep working to make sure I live up to the trust you've given me." As he walked away to join the children for another activity, Elena felt a profound sense of closure. She had seen him transform, watched him grow from a man consumed by anger and prejudice to someone committed to change and healing. The path of redemption wasn't easy, but Tully had embraced it fully, and for that, she was deeply grateful. In that moment, Elena knew her ordeal had not been in vain. The pain, the struggle, the courage it took to stand up, it had all led to this: a stronger community, a healed heart, and a future where understanding and empathy could thrive. Months after Tully and Larson had begun their journey of restitution, the community center was thriving in ways no one had anticipated. Thanks to the efforts of Maya and countless volunteers, the programs had expanded to serve people from all walks of life. And although Tully and Larson's required hours had ended, both continued to come back, volunteering their time alongside others who had once doubted them. Slowly, they'd earned a tentative respect, though forgiveness took time and would always require vigilance. The center was bustling with activity one cool autumn evening as the town gathered for a community celebration to honor the center's achievements. Elena, David, Maya, and Mrs. Anderson had been planning the event for weeks, hoping to bring people together to recognize how far they'd come as a town and as a community. The walls of the center were strung with fairy lights, casting a warm glow over the tables laden with food, handmade decorations, and photographs of all the programs and milestones they'd achieved that year. As the event kicked off, Elena took a moment to stand at the edge of the room, looking out at the crowd. She saw people from every corner of her life, the young and old, new friends and old, all laughing, talking, and sharing stories. A few feet away, Maya stood with a group of teens, showing them how to set up their booth for a community project they'd been working on. Tully and Larson were at the food table, helping pass out plates and chatting with visitors. David came up beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "Look what you started," he said with a smile, his voice full of pride. Elena leaned into him, her heart swelling with gratitude. "I never could have imagined this. I thought that day on the street was going to define everything. But somehow, it became something more." David nodded, taking in the joyful scene around them. "It did. Because you didn't let that day break you, Elena. You stood up, and you showed everyone what real strength looks like." A familiar voice came over the microphone, and Elena looked up to see Maya standing at the front of the room, smiling out over the crowd. She gestured for her parents to join her, and Elena, suddenly shy, took David's hand as they made their way to the front. "Tonight," Maya began, her voice clear and steady, "we're here to celebrate the community we've all built together. This center has become more than just a building. It's become a home, a place where people know they can come to feel seen, understood, and supported. And none of this would have happened without my mother, Elena." Elena's cheeks flushed as the crowd erupted in applause, the warmth of their appreciation filling the room. Maya continued, her eyes shining with pride. "My mother's strength and grace have been an inspiration to me my whole life. When we faced one of the hardest moments as a family, she showed us that courage isn't just about fighting back. It's about creating something meaningful from that pain. She didn't let hatred or anger define her. Instead, she chose to bring people together. And I think we can all agree that this town is better because of it." Elena blinked back tears as Maya wrapped an arm around her shoulders. The applause grew louder, and she felt herself enveloped in the love and appreciation of the community she had fought to bring together. As the clapping subsided, David leaned in and whispered in her ear, "You deserve this, Elena, every bit of it." Feeling a surge of emotion, Elena took the microphone from Maya, her hands shaking slightly. She hadn't planned on speaking, but looking out at the faces before her, the faces of neighbors, friends, and even former strangers, she felt compelled to say something. "Thank you," she began, her voice soft but steady. "Thank you all for being here tonight. I never expected my life to lead me to a moment like this. And I certainly never imagined that the hardest day of my life would lead to something as beautiful as this center and this community." She paused, her gaze settling on Tully and Larson, who were watching with expressions of humility and gratitude. "We all make mistakes, some of them big, some of them small. But what defines us isn't those mistakes. It's what we choose to do after them. It's whether we're willing to stand up, to listen, and to learn. And I think that's the greatest thing this community has shown me. No matter where we come from, no matter what we've been through, we have the power to create something better together." A hush settled over the crowd, her words resonating deeply with everyone present. Elena held back tears, her heart full. After she finished speaking, the evening continued with laughter and celebration, the air alive with music and joy. She danced with David, her children joined in, and soon the entire room was swept up in a feeling of pure happiness. It was a night that shimmered with a sense of healing, a night where past hurts were set aside and people came together in unity. As the evening wound down, Tully approached Elena, his expression serious but grateful. "Mrs. Pierce," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "thank you for everything. You didn't have to give me a second chance, but you did. You believed I could be better, even when I didn't. I don't know if I'll ever be able to repay that, but I'm going to keep trying. Every day." Elena smiled, reaching out to place a hand on his shoulder. "Officer Tully, you've done more than enough. Watching you work here, seeing you connect with people, it means the world to me, and it means the world to this town." He nodded, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "I won't let you down." After Tully walked away, Larson approached, her expression filled with warmth. "Thank you, Elena. Working here has changed my life. I'm a better officer and a better person because of what I've learned from you and everyone here." Elena pulled Larson into a gentle embrace, the gesture carrying a deep understanding. "Keep that spirit alive, Grace. The world needs more people like you on the force." As the last of the guests filtered out, Elena and her family stood outside the center, taking in the quiet beauty of the evening. The stars sparkled overhead, and the air was crisp with the promise of a new season. Maya hugged her mother, resting her head on Elena's shoulder. Mom, you turned something painful into something incredible. You've changed people's lives, and you've changed this town. I hope you know how proud we are of you. Elena's heart swelled with pride and love. She took one last look at the center, now quiet and empty, but filled with memories of the joy and healing it had witnessed. As they walked home, Elena felt a profound peace settle over her, knowing that the community she loved would continue to grow, bound together by compassion, understanding, and resilience. And she knew that no matter what challenges the future might bring, they would face them together, stronger than ever before.